everyone. Welcome back to another amazing conversation here at Power to Fly. Once again, my name is Rob Rebar. I am the Director of Events and Marketing here at Power to Fly, and I'm super excited for this next conversation, which is called Corporate Reckoning: How Women in Business Can Address Historical Wrongs. And for that, we are joined by Sarah Federman, an associate professor of conflict resolution at the University of San Diego's Kroc School of Peace Studies, and who is the author of the award-winning Transformative Negotiation: Strategies for Everyday Change and Equitable Futures. Sarah was named, and that book was named by Forbes as one of the top 10 negotiation books. She also wrote the Nautilus award-winning book Last Train to Auschwitz, The French National Railways and the Journey to Accountability, and her forthcoming book, which we're going to talk about in just a bit, Corporate Reckoning: How Businesses Can Address Historical Wrongs, out on MIT Press this year, which builds on her Harvard Business Review article and her TEDx talk, selected by TED for global distribution, as well as her two congressional testimonies concerning the responsibility of U.S. banks to resolve or to respond to slavery ties. Sarah, what an amazing bio. So thank you so much for being here
Thank,
today.
thank you for having me.
Well, let's talk about your new book, Corporate Reckonings, your upcoming book. And in that book, you argue that companies must confront difficult histories. So, what does a true corporate reckoning actually look like in practice and not just symbolically?
Yeah, it really starts with knowing your history. We often don't know that we don't know the true histories of the organizations that we work with, or the schools that we went to, or the museums that we visit, right? So part of it comes from just like acknowledging and questioning what we do know and how do we know what we know. Maybe there'll be a little timeline or a little about us section of a corporate website, but employees don't really know the true story. Often board members don't even know the true story, or the executives don't know. They come from another company. They don't know the like 100-year history. So the first is saying, what do we think we know about the history? And where did we get that information? And do we have it all? And I've worked with a company, I just worked with a whiskey brand that was doing that work, just saying, wait, whiskey's pretty old and we think we know, but we're not sure we know. So it starts really with just an inquiry, which is not one that should make people defensive because nobody in the company did it. We all inherit these histories. In school, little by little, they start to tell us, like, oh my God, this is what the good things about our country, that the times we've sort of failed morally. So it's similar to that, thinking of it as like helping people first get socialized to the idea that we want to understand our past. And then once you know them, you can sort of think about how to respond to them. But I wouldn't jump to worrying about how to respond. I would really just invite people into the conversation first to get curious.
I love that. I think that's what often gets lost now because we jump right to what you said. Like, we need to respond to this. Like, people
Yeah.
are demanding an answer, but it's like, well, wait a second. Let's take a pause. Let's look at the history. Let's go back and study this and kind of come together and have a conversation. So I think
Yeah.
that's what these summits and our events are all about. And I love that you're kind of bringing it back to, okay, first off, we have to gather together and really examine this before we jump to any conclusions.
I find it hard to study history and have a moral lens at the same moment.
Mm.
It's like when you're judging something while being curious, it like sort of thwarts you. It's like, let's just first understand and then sort of think about, yeah, it's just hard to do both at the same time.
Oh, yes, completely agree. And many organizations, I mean, you talked about a whiskey brand. Some of these brands are so storied and old,
Yeah.
and many organizations over 50 years old have these ties to painful chapters in our history. So, why is this right now, 2026? Why is this moment so critical for businesses to really address their own legacies?
Yeah. Yeah, because it could seem on the one hand, well, this seems like a moment of corporate impunity. Why should I
Yeah.
even bother looking back?
Yes.
And I get that. I mean, I think one thing, if you've been on around, at least 25 years in your life, you know that the past comes back to bite you.
Hmm.
So it's actually a good moment. Companies are concerned about maybe virtue signaling, or they get canceled if they do or if they don't. Like they're scared about
Yes.
what to say. And so it's a really good moment to go internal and just do the work yourself inside. It's not a moment to sort of stand up, or maybe you want to in different ways, but it's a great moment to just do an internal sort of audit of the past and say and hire someone to do that research. Start talking to your stakeholders about what they think about that past and do that work now, because it does come back. I mean, when I started writing this book, it was a moment of reckoning. Now we feel like we're a moment of impunity, but
Hmm.
none of those executives who were part of the uh, World War II that were supporting the Nazi war effort thought that it would ever come around to get them, and it did. So, like, it does come back around.
Yeah, it's making me think, especially the work we do here, Power to Fly, a lot of it is rooted in inclusion. And a lot of companies jumped into the deep end of the pool with that during the COVID years. And I think one of the reasons they've pulled back from it now, not just as kind of the exterior forces of politics, although that played, I think, a very significant
Yeah.
role, but often a lot of them jumped into that without fully understanding what work actually needed to be done. And
Yeah.
now that we're a
Yeah.
few years back from that, they're like, well, wait a second, we invested all this money into this, but what are we actually seeing from this? Or did we ever actually take the time to understand why we're doing this work? So I
Yeah.
agree. I think despite the fact that right now it seems like maybe a dangerous time for some companies to be exploring this, it's actually beneficial because we have a moment to breathe in order
Yeah.
to kind of explore our histories.
Yeah, there are these moments when it's time to talk about it, when it's time to study it. John Brightwaite, who's a famous scholar in restorative justice and in shaming, and even some on corporate accountability, he had this great idea when I talked to him about this book project of saying, wouldn't it be great if when corporations are socializing people to their company or doing any ethics training, they talk about something that the company did wrong in the past and be
Hmm.
like, listen, way back, like you'd start any of these, even the inclusion trainings, right? Like why inclusion training? And you jump right into biases and microaggressions, and like people are like, whoa, but start, not everybody knows where that came from.
Yeah.
So say, okay, we decimated this community. We made a terrible business decision. We flooded out an indigenous community and we didn't listen to their voices. And that's not who we want to be going forward. And that gives people a lot of trust in you because they know that you're not just going to keep sugarcoating everything and spinning it. So that's one thing companies could do now too, is just as part of whatever training they're doing, whatever culture building, talk about the great moments and talk about the failing moments.
I love that. I think that's great. And this kind of ties into what else I wanted to ask you because you're talking about company culture. And now, really more than ever before, I think we're seeing younger generations really increasingly prioritize the values alignment at work. Like they want to work with, if
Yeah.
one company offers them more money, but it's against their values, chances are they're going to go with the one that's paying less, but giving them maybe it's more flexibility or maybe it's closer to their value system. So, how can leaders balance that transparency about historical harms while still protecting kind of their greater brand reputation
Yeah.
and stakeholder confidence?
Those wonderful young people who feel that way, they're not gonna, you'll get them by saying it. Like, if you like there's some companies that they no longer want to work for. But if those companies were to say, whoa, we're really in the middle of a moral turn right now, and we want your help to help us get there, I think they would jump in. I mean, I don't think I was just talking to a computer science peace studies major undergrad and about we were talking about which companies he would work for and which ones he won't and why, even though the salaries are so big. But he was really interested in ones that had the moral commitments. So I think I understand this because I was in advertising for a decade. The brand building is about looking good and about avoiding looking bad.
Hmm. Yeah.
But strong relationships are when you have both. I mean, long partnerships don't work that way in relationships in our lives. Like nobody's going to keep looking perfect if you spend too much time with them. So I think it's much more authentic and it builds more resilience to acknowledge moral failures and moral wins and company wins and innovative wins. The other thing is that by talking about the past, you're helping the company not have huge blind spots for the future. So you're having
Mhm.
these young people come in and say, okay, hold on, but if you do that, think of who you're leaving out. And that you're just kicking the can down to the next generation. Now, getting people to care about that is a whole other challenge.
Yeah, yeah. So much of this is just making me think like there's these little things that we don't always recognize, especially I think with some of the big companies. I was just listening recently to a podcast and they were saying, well, how big companies are often creating these campuses where you basically don't leave. But in that way, are you ever interacting with the greater neighborhood around you and the other people in the area? So, I mean, that's not a
Yes.
historical pain going back 50 years, but it is something it's like it's separating you from everyone around. And maybe it's better that you just let people go out to the bodega down the street and grab a sandwich and have that interaction and also give back to the current environment around you. So I think a lot of people are starting to realize, oh yeah, maybe we shouldn't just be in this bubble. We should start to listen to everyone that's around us as
Yeah.
well.
Oh, I have such a specific example about that. And I had such a great, there's a 900 person town in Arizona called Patagonia. And it has some of the most ecologically diverse wildlife. And it's like a hummingbird center of the country. And there's a big mining project happening there. And the mining company changed its schedule so that the mini mart in town didn't get the miners, like separating the ecological impact of the mine, which is a huge
Mhm.
topic. But just to your point about the bodega, they stopped coming to the bodega because they changed the hours of the miners or the road that they took, and they like plummeted this poor little mini mart, you know?
Yeah.
So this company has I love what you say because companies have impacts beyond the product they produce, right? So what is their footprint on the community? Not paying them off to get the mine, but like what's the larger impact?
Yeah, I love that. And obviously here, Power to Fly very much connected to empowering women as well. So I want to talk what role can women specifically in leadership
Yeah.
uniquely play in ensuring institutions don't erase or minimize their connections to historical injustices? Because in many cases, there wouldn't have been women leaders 50 years ago. This is
Yeah.
almost a relatively new thing
Yeah.
at many of these companies.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've seen in the past few years that just being a woman does not make you a great
No, that
person.
is true.
So good. I'm like, feel like glad that we cleared that up, that the
Hmm.
answer is not just replacing all men with women and we'll be okay. But I think that does sort of invite a more a different conversation around when women get into positions of power, at least this past generation, and I hope it will be different for the ones coming up, there's a feeling that you need to act like the power structure to be recognized, to be treated seriously. So basically, act like, quote unquote, like a stereotypical man in power. And so women start to sort of fit that mold just to stay at the table and justify being at the table, right? Like, yeah, I know finance. Yeah, I think strategy. But what I hope for this and for women is to be able to speak their truth as they are without having to become someone else to justify being in those positions. And in this work, that means, it's like being a woman, you don't just have to talk about women's issues, but pushing actually a different timeline and saying, actually, we need to think backwards and we need to think forwards. And my contribution is going to be stretching us a little bit. People listening to this probably have heard about the seven generations idea, some indigenous group thinking about seven generations before them and seven generations after them. I mean, I think we would be good if we could get 5 years forward and back versus quarters. But I think there's a way for women in power now who want to do some work, contribution work, is actually just help stretch the timeline a little bit. Let's just
Hmm.
think about this in 5 years looking back. Let's think about how this was in the past. And that's a way I think to stay in the conversation, but help us start to shift.
Yeah, I love that. And I think you're very right. Like maybe 5 years seems doable. Maybe
It's
5 generations is a little tough
a
right
lot to
now.
ask.
But
Yeah.
I love that. I think that's great advice. And And for companies that are confronting these legacies tied to slavery, indigenous exploitation, the Holocaust, where should they begin if they generally want to move from acknowledgement to repair? One thing I'm thinking
Hmm.
of is I come from a theater background originally. I go to a
Oh,
lot of theater in New York City where I'm based, and all theaters, all off-Broadway theaters now do a land acknowledgement. But
uh-huh,
it always annoys me a bit because I always think, are you producing work by Indigenous playwrights? Are you
uh-huh.
doing, or do you have a scholarship for, upcoming Indigenous actors? You're
Right.
just kind of saying the land acknowledgement. Like, so it feels like that's the acknowledgement part, but we're not really in the repair part there.
Yeah. 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 I think about that like, yes, I've stolen your car and then I continue to drive it. You
Yes,
know?
exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Like, well, Billie Eilish, who like, made this big statement, I was at the Grammys, about Indigenous, you know, land ownership and so on. And then some groups found out that her home was on Indigenous land. And then it was like, well,
Mhm.
what are you doing? You're in our. Um, so, yeah, I think acknowledgement is a piece. And I think it's important to think about this work in pieces, that a statement without any backing doesn't hold up. So, even with an apology, there's a whole literature on apology, which is so fun to read. And of course, different cultures have different structures of apology. The one that's sort of Western, that sort of grows out of a Christian tradition and even Freudian, is like, the idea of I acknowledge what I've done, I acknowledge the impact on you, I say what I'm going to do to prevent it from happening again, and I repair the harm. That's like a full apology. And so a land acknowledgement includes, probably best said, we're sitting on this unceded lands, and we have these three programs right now in which we're
Mhm.
working with the indigenous community. Or next season, you're going to see a play about something.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I have seen two plays in San Diego that deal with reckoning. One had to do with indigenous dispossession. So I do want to say there was one at the La Jolla Playhouse. um, yeah, but and that's true. They can all sound disingenuous.
Yeah. Yeah, and companies are more prone, and we kind of touched on this before, but are more prone than ever to avoid politics, difficult conversations in the workplace. We've had executive forums here with invited like C-suite leaders, and a lot of them
Hmm.
are struggling very much with like, okay, do we talk about what's happening? Do we
Yeah,
ignore it? And if we ignore it, people are just it's gonna fester there under the surface. So how do you balance that fear where it's always been the third rail of like the one thing you don't talk about in the
yeah,
office is politics, while everyone, of course, when they're not working, is refreshing news sites and reading about politics and kind of ignoring these honest conversations. So how do you
yeah,
have those honest
yeah.
conversations amongst this level of fear?
That's such a great point. And at certain times, in certain moments, it's easier than others. Sometimes you get pushed. Like I didn't like the French National Railways that I studied, did not expect to be transporting people to concentration camps.
Hmm.
That wasn't why they created a rail company, right? And they're like, whoa, whoa, now we've been taken over by Germans. Now we are doing this. And then they're like, we have to talk about it. And they probably didn't really talk about it. Um, so there's two things. One, our companies being political, the amount of money that's going from companies to political candidates does seem to suggest that whether or not they're making political statements, they are participating. But maybe there's a difference between, the ones, maybe you're thinking about more the mid-sized ones that aren't
Hmm.
doing those huge donations. There's the big ones are in a very
Sure.
different game. Yeah, but let's say like the mid-sized companies, like what do you do as a mid-sized company without trying to sound political? No, well, one thing is to know going in, and I think they do, that you're damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah.
So, one thing is to talk about culture and the world that we want to create. What world do we want to live in? What do we want the impact of our company to be on the world? There's a way to talk about the institution's contribution. Um, Target, for example, there was a lot of pressure on Target during the Minneapolis siege, stampede on Minneapolis. So they had to decide. One of the things I was doing an interview about, I was saying, well, they should work on their own corporate culture because there was a lot of problems with Target, people who worked there long before all this came up.
Hmm.
So, like,
Hmm.
start with your insides. And I think people want to talk about values. They want to talk about the world they want to be in. And people are scared about having clean water anymore or clean air or, the heat of the planet. And I think talking about the company's role and values is a way to center it on the concerns without having to talk about what they out there are doing. That would be one way.
Hmm. Yeah, whether you are a mission-driven company or not, I have certainly advised other companies to go and put some kind of mission statement on your site. That way, it's a statement for people who work there, and it's a statement for anyone who's looking to apply to that
Yes.
role as well. And I always say, that extends to, AI right now, where like you could put a mission statement of like, this is how we're using AI. You can even say maybe we're not sure about some of this stuff, how we're going to be using it in the future. But at least if you state it there, you're kind of putting it up front to people who both work for you and might potentially want to work for you. It's like, okay, I at least see that you're acknowledging the use of this in this way, or you're acknowledging what your company's value systems are. And there's still so many companies that don't have that actually in a
Yeah.
forward-facing way.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good way to help build culture and communication
Mhm.
from a conflict perspective. It actually pans out. It does help to have those values. And I think
Totally.
that yeah. And just depending on the company, if you're in a city where a lot's going down, you may want to have an open forum for people to talk about it or bring experts in for people to talk about the moment and the role of businesses.
Well,
You
the
know,
thing I've seen there too, which makes so sense, is when leaders say we acknowledge that our employees are adults and they're able to talk about these things. And so many, they feel like it's still sometimes you're treated with kid gloves, where it's like, you can't talk about this, but it's like, okay, we're all adults. We can talk about this. And especially if there is something going on that's in your
Yeah.
actual home, that you need to discuss that.
And there are great facilitators and mediators that can
Mhm.
help you have a great conversation because I think we do know that tech and things has made things a little bit harder. Not everyone's so great at communicating verbally where they are, but there are experienced people all around the country that can help with that.
I love that. Yes, totally. And some right here at Power to Fly. It's
Right,
shamelessly. So,
good. Hire them
so
all.
what would you say? What are some of the common mistakes that organizations make when attempting to address these historical wrongs, and how can they avoid these
Hmm.
kind of surface level responses? You don't have to give specific examples, but what
Sure.
have you seen out there?
One of the mistakes I see is to spend, so you go from the history, when you go from the history, knowing it to the action, uh, trying to figure out what percentage of the harm is yours and spending a
Mhm.
lot of time focusing on you. And then there needs to be a shift to how the legacy is showing up in the present. Does that make sense? So the research phase is all about you, your organization, what it did, what happened. And then you pivot and you're like, okay, we're not still part of the transatlantic slave trade, but there's huge legacies, and maybe we understand that, maybe we don't. Maybe there's people in our organization who don't understand how it's connected to the past, and that's understandable. So you bring people in to help you understand those legacies. And then you turn and you find a way to address them in the now. So I think that's one mistake. Don't making that not making that pivot. Well, we only did this thing, so we're gonna help. We did 2%, and so our response is this percent. Um, One is focusing on the money versus on the need, and you want to partner with those legacy communities to help understand descendants, like what they need, what does that community need now, and address that now. Yeah, what's showing, not what you think. It's very easy in a box to like be like, we should do this, we should start a scholarship. But people might be like, we don't want a scholarship, we need housing
Mhm.
grants, or like we need people to like whatever, we need transportation or infrastructure, or and the third is that sometimes the best way to contribute might not be something that's easy to brag about. Like don't look for like to claim the win. Just focus on doing the
Yes.
work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I definitely I love that. Yeah. And as we start to wrap up here, Sarah, if you could give one piece of advice to women executives specifically who want to lead with moral courage in
Hmm.
this area about everything we've talked about, but
Mm.
still worry about that career risk, what would
Yeah.
that advice be to those women executives?
Hmm. I think coming in with curiosity is less threatening. You
Mm,
know, I mean, and maybe I don't know if you're talking about women in organizations that have these histories or those who don't. And having conversations like, so curiosity about the past, if you're in a heritage company, or raising questions of like, well, how do we want to be remembered? Helping people.
Yeah,
There's a series of narrative technologies where you help people get out of their moment and you help say, like, okay, so like in 5 years looking back, like, how do we sort of want this to unfold? Or how do we want this to be seen by our kids? Or I don't know, maybe this will help, but I met this wonderful man who, when he and his wife were getting a divorce, they had very young kids, and they said to the lawyer, help us write a divorce settlement that when our kids are old enough and they can read it, they'll be proud of us.
I love that. Yeah.
So, thinking of that, the next generation, what can we do today so that the future, people in this community and the next people who take over this company will be proud of us?
Yeah, and I think right now, kind of talking about this time, as we've seen companies that have pulled back on some of these kind of initiatives during this kind of political time, or even pulled back on, say, flexible work or whatever that is.
Yeah.
I think that's going to come back and bite many of them when they're trying to hire the next generation, when Gen Alpha, for example, is
Yeah.
going into the workplace and suddenly, other people have gone out and we need to fill these roles, then suddenly a lot of those people are going to like, I remember what you did in 2026, and I don't know if I want to work for you now. So I think
Yeah.
it's there.
Yeah. Oh, here comes Alpha.
Exactly. And as we wrap up here, love for you to say, where else can people connect with you, hear about your work, and of course, most importantly, where can they get your new book, Corporate Reckoning?
Great. So I have a website, so I'm very easy to find. Either from my university email or my the website comes to me. And yeah, the book is available where books are sold. I do encourage people to go to support local bookstores.
Yes.
And I also want to say local bookstores includes Barnes and Noble. They've done a lot to support authors, and they're starting to shift their role in communities. So they were sort of seen as the big box bad guy, but I think they're sort of coming around too. So I really want people to support that. Plus, go talk to people about the books. It's so fun to talk to people in bookstores. They know so much about the books there, and to have those conversations. But yes, it's available online. Penguin distributes it, so when you just put the book title in, it'll pop up.
And I would say if you have an ERG, maybe a women's ERG or another organization at your company, maybe have a book club and discuss the
Oh yeah,
book.
and I'll be happy if
Then you
you
can
zoom
have
me in. Yeah,
exactly zoom in, Sarah, and then you can start these conversations with this as the jumping off
yeah.
point. So I think I love that.
For those who are afraid of the book or not sure, the TEDx talk is very short, so it gives you, and that's on YouTube if you just want to get a sense of what I'm talking about more in depth.
Amazing. Well, we'll link to the book. We'll link to your TEDx talk in our post-summit blog post. So if you're watching this live, check back in a little bit for that. If you're watching the recording, well, it's probably already ready. So just search the Power to Fly website and you can find that. Sarah, thank you so much for spending this
Here,
time with us and sharing everything that you have shared with us today. We really appreciate it, and I know our audience really appreciates it as well.
thank you. Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.